What woman hasn't looked at Clark Gable on the silver screen? Am I dating myself? Hasn't looked at Clark Gable and said, oh, and especially when he was playing Fletcher Christian. Well, there was a young girl in Norway, Kari Boye, who saw Clark Gable on the silver screen and followed her dream to eventually get to Pitcairn Island. How did Kari do this? Well, she became a radio officer on a ship and did so for 7 years, and finally she was able to arrive in Pitcairn in 1973. And even more than that, in 1978, she married Brian Young. And they have 2 children, a daughter who is now living in Norway and a son who is now living in Australia. In 1982, Kari published a book in Norway about her life on Pitcairn. And she is quoting, when she speaks to you today, recordings made from Maynard Warren and Andrew Young. So that should be really interesting for us. In 1995, they moved back to New Zealand for the children's education so they could attend high school and college, and then moved back to Pitcairn in 2007. Kari is co-editor of Demtool Pitcairn, and she's going to speak to us on the resourcefulness of the Pitcairn Islanders and what they've had to become resourceful with in order to survive. Very important. Kari.
When I married and settled on Pitcairn in 1978, I realized I didn't bring many skills to the island. There was no use for an academic on Pitcairn. In order to survive, I had to learn to plant and weed gardens, climb hills and cliffs, go fishing and catch fish, make carvings, bake bread, to make do and to live without. I had a lot to learn from the islanders. Just because of their physical education, the islanders turned into extremely resourceful people, well suited for their kind of life in the middle of nowhere. They are a people of action, of innovation, self-reliance, and stubbornness, known as jacks of all trades, handy with tools, with engines, generators, fishing equipment. They can fix just about anything, at least temporarily, till the next ship arrives with spare parts. The way they organized and ran their small community made it survive over 200 years, thanks to their own ingenuity. Could it have survived if it had been a dysfunctional community, as some claimed it was? Charles Chauvel wrote after his visit in 1932, "Their government and social troubles, their sufferings, their fights, their calamities, their deaths, not an echo of this is ever heard by the outside world. Necessity has taught Pitcairn to live unto itself, to govern itself, and to amuse itself." Chauvel had no idea how true on every level those words were, nor of the devastation this state of affairs would eventually lead to, and how we, 80 years after, still live unto ourselves because of the isolation and lack of outside stimulus. In 1937, a report said that there is no form of leisure by day and no amusement by night on Pitcairn Island. Apparently, books are seldom read. Now, how could such a community sustain itself? Initially, Pitcairners loved to read. Captain King said in 1819, nothing pleased them as well as the books, as they wished much to read and write. Adams was aware of his academic shortcomings and welcomed John Buffett when he jumped ship in 1823 to be their teacher. Yet they could not write. Even in 1835, they signed with their marks. Tiraura told that her husband Edward Young used to read to her and Isaac Martin from the Bible and other books. Martin missed the stimulation of the outside world, and it is still like that on Pitcairn. Monotony and the isolation from outside ideas, opinions, and plain news could crush your mind if you don't activate it in a positive way. Already in 1815, Captain Pippon said, "In this little retreat there is not much variety, and the description of one day's occupation serves equally for its successor." A very sobering statement. Reports in 1897 revealed that the islanders were worse off than ever, with little clothes and supplies, with declining morals and a host of illegitimate children. There was little interest in books, but they passionately wanted education for their children, and the local teachers did the best they could. Not until 1950 did the British send the first teacher. In spite of the blessings of literacy and education, Pitcairners could not have existed with only book learning. It was their maritime excellence, their knowledge of the ocean and the weather, that sustained the island for 220 years without much help from the outside. It was also their only lifeline to the world out there. Officers on the Surrey in 1821 told how young men came out to meet them, and the officers waited in the boat outside the harbor, the native canoes going in first, then Ed Quintal swimming back out to guide. The rest got upon a high rock. This scene, I think, the most romantic I ever read of or even saw. The men on the rocks with the plantain leaves in their hands watched the roll of the sea and kept us from coming in till the subsiding of the waves offered a good opportunity. Then they all waved their leaves and cried out, "Start now." They took hold of the boat and ran her out of the surf. The passengers got out, and the islanders took the boat on their shoulders and carried it ashore. A yachtsman's observations in 1935. A tanned and well-built young man with unmistakable traces of Polynesian blood braced in the stern, wielding a long, heavy sweep of a rudder. He was Andrew Young, lineal descendant of Lieutenant Young of the Bounty. The oarsmen obeyed his crisp orders implicitly, and there was no levity or useless talk as we neared the deadly line of smoking breakers, which curled and roared over a barrier of ugly-looking rocks. Access to Pitcairn has not changed since 1808. The Pitcairn boats and canoes have carried cargo and passengers ashore in the same way, though we got motorized boats today. In December 1900, the Pitcairners arrived off the island with fire in the cargo. Island leader Russell McCoy piloted the ship to Mango River, where it was grounded and the ship saved. The story inspired Jack London to write the novel The Seed of McCoy, presenting our Russell as a hero. A religion. Ship's crew of the first part of the 19th century found a very law-abiding and God-abiding community. There had been only one sermon during Fletcher Christian's lifetime, but Adams instituted family worship twice a day, church worship twice a week, and the decision to live by the Bible saved them from the earlier chaos and anarchy. The church was until recently the main social arena, and many of the traditions centered around church. Since they didn't have money, they invented their own tithe system. Produce from every 10th row in the garden, every 10th fish caught, etc., was carried to the tithe house to be sold to other islanders or on the ships. Their only link with the outside world, longboats and fishing canoes, were built by the Pitcairn men. They used local timber, first looking for trees the right length and shape, then cutting it on their pit saw. They were excellent builders and carpenters, whether boats, houses, or furniture, all with elegant and functional lines. Russell McCoy designed and built the longboat in the late 1800s, considered better suited for Pitcairn than the one Queen Victoria sent, which was kept mainly on display, and Russell's boat was the model for the later longboats. The last longboat was built at the age in 1982. Today the longboats are built of aluminium, the canoes of fiberglass and marine ply. In 1892, they built their famous two-story church and dormitories for their proposed missionary school for Pacific youth. In 1916, the 45-foot-long schooner Messenger was launched, said to have cost 15 shillings, built by Public Work. The nails were made from old iron collected from every Pitcairn family. They were desperate for contact with the outside world, and the messenger provided an outlet for their produce, a chance to trade and to travel. But they lost her after only 4 years. In 1920, she sank off the island in a bad storm, and the 17 passengers rescued by a passing ship. Andrew told the story. On her last trip, we had sent 6 bags of dry tithe plum, but our crew gave it to their friends in Mangareva. The Lord punished them by sinking the ship. They were just within sight of Pitcairn, and islanders saw them in the Loward. Every morning, people go out for Lookout Yenna, hoping for good weather so them could come ashore, but weather beat them back. On Tuesday, boat go out for try help them. I was crew for Emmon and Lincoln on our schooner. Then been out of food long time and weather sink messenger. He was angry. In the 1960s, the Pitcairn men built the first jetty on the extension that the Rock's Mummy and Daddy already formed to give more protection in the harbor. They were not engineers, but they mixed concrete, blew up rocks, and managed to create a jetty which lasted for decades without any expert help. A team of Royal Engineers were present to plan and supervise work on later extensions to the jetty. I don't know when the unique Pitcairn wheelbarrow was invented and put to use, but probably more than 100 years ago. It was used for carrying garden produce, tools, and children. The men also carried their to'os, a stick over their shoulders with a basket hanging at each end to balance it. In the mid-60s, the first 2-wheel motorbike arrived, then the ATVs, and the art of running died out. Pitcairners of old were excellent runners because they had to be. Maynard tell, when ship had been sighted and the bells rung, all the men had to get to the landing, and we waited for no one. We had to row and could not waste precious moments in case we lost the ship. Long before I was old enough to go out to ship, I had to run get Christy, who was out fishing and could not hear the bells ring. At Outer Fence, I met Jebbet, our magistrate, and he told me to go home. They wouldn't wait for Christy. But I kept going and found Christy at Danfall. He ran while I carried his fishing basket home. When Jebbet arrived at the landing, Christy was there, breathless but ready for his turn at the oars. One time when most of us had run out of gunpowder, Floyd offered a tin of gunpowder to anyone who could run to Ted's side and bring back a handful of sand from the beach there within 30 minutes. That's at least an hour's walk and very, very steep. Kari was a young man then and did it in 35 minutes, but Floyd gave him the prize anyway. Oh, Kari could run good. That's it. A description of the village in the very early days. Their habitations are extremely neat, infinitely superior to what we saw at the Marquesas Island. The little village at Pitcairn forms a pretty square. The center is a fine lawn where the poultry wander, but is fenced in to prevent the intrusion of hogs. It was easy to perceive that in this establishment, the labor and ingenuity of European hands had been exerted. We never witnessed any regular plan of laying out the grounds in the other islands we visited. Their houses were different from Polynesian dwellings and from Western-style houses. They were unique, with wooden sliding shutters for windows, long tables with benches, beds in one big room upstairs, reached by a ladder. All furniture was homemade until recently. The kitchen was a separate cookhouse, according to Polynesian traditions, but the white picket fence was very European. Mattresses were stuffed with ruhulu, the crackling dry banana leaves, and folks remember sleeping on them till it became more common and affordable to order the commercial mattress from New Zealand. Buffett tells in his diary of 1869 that the women were cutting Aute in Outer Valley and Brownswater for 2 weeks, and after another week, the women had finished beating the tapa. It took a lot of time to produce enough clothes for a household. All their clothes and bedding were made of tapa, canvas from sails, or sailors' clothes, which the women transformed into dresses, blouses, etc. Later on, they got donations from overseas friends, and that continued into our days, when they also sold their clothes. They made their own shoes from canvas and rope, but that was for dressing up. Even in 1973, when I arrived, almost everybody went barefoot except in church. The only water was from the rain and a few precious springs. The islanders had reservoirs in Tedside and carried water to town in calabashes. The innovative Russell McCoy set up a piping system to supply water from Brown Spring to town, an aqueduct constructed of split bamboos on trestles which conveyed water to the village. While McCoy's generation used split bamboo, we use rubber hoses, but otherwise the principle is the same, so not much have changed. To store rainwater running off the roof, big concrete cisterns were set up by every house to take them through the droughts. There was no store on Pitcairn until the 1960s, and whatever the islanders needed, they had to get in trading with ships. Money was non-existent, and they learned to barter with what they had. Few of their requirements could be bought on the island. In 1912, the council reported to British authorities that fungus, arrowroot, and coffee had taken the place of cash on the island, and court fines were paid in produce. In the 1960s, government jobs were established, and people were paid money for their work. The Pitcairners expected fungus, coffee, dried bananas, arrowroot flour, wana, whelk, and shells to Mangareva and Tahiti from the 1890s till 1920. Maynard talked about the harvesting of fungus. Every other month, the bells rang for people to pick fungus. As soon as we gathered at the square with our baskets, the magistrate shouted, "Go!" and people disappeared in every direction. We were running on every hill. Everybody wanted to come first to the grounds to fill their baskets. The fungus was dried in the sun, baked in ovens, and sent to Mangareva and Tahiti on the trading schooners. One family could pick 4 basketfuls, and that meant a whole bag of dried fungus to send on the schooner in return for flour or rice from the islands. One of His Majesty's ships, the Algerine, picked up 77 bags of fungus, 7 bags of coffee, and 5 bags of arrowroot to be delivered in Tahiti for sale in 1913. And Captain Brooker was impressed with their will to expand and by the stubbornness of their character. The Algerine was the last official visit of His Majesty's ships for almost 25 years. Pitcairn lost contact with Mangareva after the Messenger sank, but ships coming through the Panama Canal started visiting. They sold fresh fruit and the new commodity, carvings, to passengers on the steamships. The Austrian sailor Leffler taught the men the art of carving, which even today is developing and expanding with new ideas and concepts for the tourist trade. Oranges were exported to New Zealand till the 1960s. Up to 300 crates could be sent off on one single ship, but it was a risky business. If the expected ship didn't turn up, the oranges rotted. The community spirit was very strong because safety and security was in their family, their clan, their neighbor. There was no insurance for sickness or for old age. They traded as a community on the ships, tithe trading first, then individual trading. The share-out principle was another example of the community spirit, sharing out equally to each family, so there was no rich or poor. All islanders belonged to the same social class. Pippin on the Tagus said in 1815, "We may well observe that here necessity is the mother of invention. For the forge they landed from the Bounty, being now out of order, by dint of labor and assiduity, they have now got into a method of making their own agricultural tools, beating out their spade of solid iron, and in reality very well executed." Pitcairners of old produced their own salt. Maynard tell, boiling salt took weeks. Large pans of seawater were boiled till only salt was left in the pan, shoveled out, and the pans filled again with the next boil. Several families worked together, for it was hard work and took a long time. We used to set up camps down Isaacs in Tedside or Tautama, and the women minded the pans while the men went for firewood all day, for they could not let the fire go out. The men kept the fire going through the night. Oh, I might go too much. I have to skip. Andrew Young was a self-taught radio operator. Early in the 1920s, he and 3 friends practiced Morse in the night by flashing signals by lantern to each other from the different hilltops around Adamstown. In 1928, he set up his first crystal receiver driven by an old car engine. For years, the men had watched for ship up on the ridge as part of public work, but now they could rely on Andrew telling when ships would call. On hearing about his enterprise, the Marconi company sent 2 radio technicians to install a new transceiver, issuing a ham license, and he operated as VR6AY for many years. There was no government-funded radio station till the war years. Andrew and friends initiated and then ran the station themselves till then. Pitcairn never had a medical professional till the 1950s, except for doctors coming ashore for a few hours. The islanders managed as best they could with medicines they got from ships or their own concoctions. During the many influenza epidemics, with half the population in bed, they were nursed by those still up and around. The school would close for weeks on end, and most activities would come to a halt. They suffered from and died from dysentery, typhoid, asthma, lockjaw, burns, tuberculosis, and dropsy. And Nobbs prescribed diluted ashes, ether, brandy, laudanum, turpentine, bread poultice, emetics, and bleeding. Oh, I have to skip a lot. They were not sophisticated in political and legal matters. Decisions were both naive and arbitrary, but I am convinced their first constitution is the result of their own concept of a democratic society and a groundbreaking document for human rights. Captain Russell, who assisted with their document in 1838, would not have thought of equal voting rights and equal right to education for both gender. In spite of regular reports from British observers about extreme sexual practices, 13-year-old mothers, 30 children out of wedlock by 1908, shocking facts for that time, there was absolutely no corrective or educational measures taken by the British authorities until 2000. And that is the real tragedy of the Pitcairners' isolation. Thank you.